Good, we're ready to begin. And let me begin by first of all welcoming all of you for joining us here in the Trinity Long Room Hub, and also many people who are joining us for the live stream of this discussion, which is our next session in the Trinity Long Room Hub's hosting of the Arts and Humanities Festival in Research here at Trinity. My name's Eve Patton, I'm Director of the Trinity Long Room Hub, and I'm very pleased to be welcoming this afternoon Patrick Houlihan, who joins us from the School of History and Humanities. And I think, as most of you here will know, Patrick is a scholar in the field of the history of religion in the 20th century, among many other areas of history, but that is his speciality, and it lends itself to the subject of his new book, which is Religious Humanitarianism during the World Wars, 1914 to 1945, and its subtitle, which we might hear a bit more about, Between Atheism and Messianism. And I'm very pleased, Patrick, to welcome you to the Hub today.
Thanks very much, Eve. Thanks very much, Eve, and really my thanks to the entire Long Room Hub team. It's really an oasis of interdisciplinary research and a wonderful forum here. And thanks for the opportunity to present this book, but also a continuing research interest of mine. And thanks also to family, friends, and colleagues who are here and who've helped enable this book. So I study war as a source of social change. War as a source and a force for social change. And when people say they study war, many people, both scholars and the public, tend to focus on the destruction and devastation of war, the killing, battles, weapons, etc. These are, of course, essential parts of what war is. But such narrow focus leads us to miss learning about peace, reconstruction, and healing. The processes of relief and reconstruction begin before war is even over. So far from a linear kind of stop-start process here of opposites, in fact, war and peace are interrelated concepts, and you really can't study one without studying the other. Now, in so doing, we study ourselves as a society, who we are, what are our values, and value conflicts with other societies. What society do we want to become? And what kind of social ideals do we try to force upon the world through processes of aid, reconstruction, and development? The ultimate irony of history is that it includes study of the past, but it's very much an argument about the present and an imagined future. It's a contested work in progress. Now, by studying ideology, and particularly humanitarianism, I use the era of the World Wars, 1914 to 1945, to address fundamental historical questions of continuity and change. I look at the world of 1914, causing us to be confronted with total war's disaster, asking, among other things, what hope we can have for the future. And this study of humanitarianism helps to contribute to asking fundamental questions such as, what is humane? And indeed, insight into that eternal question, what is a human being? Next slide. Yep. Thank you. So I'll begin with David Suchet as Hercule Poirot, Agatha Christie's famous Belgian detective in a brilliant series of novels with a worldwide readership, and the character of Poirot indeed got an obituary in the New York Times in 1975. So why do I begin with Hercule Poirot? He's a war refugee. And this takes us back to the war refugee moment of 1914. Agatha Christie's Poirot was introduced in The Mysterious Affair at Styles, published in 1920. Christie chose Poirot's identity because Belgian refugees were flooding Britain during the Great War. And Poirot, as a war refugee, is an outsider to his adopted society in England. In his detective career, Poirot often uses this outsider status to great effect, often accentuated through his personal eccentricity. He catches murderers who are lulled into complacency, with the English villains having been falsely convinced of their smug superiority to what they considered a, quote, damned foreigner. And that's quoting Christie in Murder on the Orient Express. So Belgium became this icon of the rationale for fighting World War I, visually and morally, with war refugees as the key actors. Belgium's neutrality and the German military violation of that neutrality helped bring Britain into the war in 1914, and German atrocities in Belgium became a cause of global outrage. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention John Horn, whom I see in the audience here. John and Alan Kramer have co-written an excellent book on the German atrocities of 1914. So if you want more information, you read their book, Horn and Kramer, the German atrocities of 1914. So this became a focus of global outrage and focusing the humanitarian efforts on the American Relief Administration, directed by Herbert Hoover, and this was an early intervention. I talk about it in my book. You can read more of it then. Agatha Christie wrote this self-caricature into her novels. She invented a character of Ariadne Oliver. This was a mystery writer, and this is Oliver's fictional detective, Sven Hjersen from Finland. Now, this literary invention speaks to the incomprehensibility of moral sentiment between refugees and well-wishers. Christie indirectly laments via Ariadne Oliver and Sven Hjersen's Finland how much Christie didn't know about Poirot's Belgium. And Belgium was a developed, industrialized Western European nation just across the English Channel. So, cute little Poirot and the bygone values of quaint murder mysteries set in the early 20th century England. We are not as far away from these events as we think. In 1914, war was raging not only in Western Europe, but also in Eastern Europe, as Russian armies advanced. It's 2024, and Russian armies are on the march again. And this is indeed why I have the second photo up here of Martin Buber, author of, among other things, the I and Thou dialectic. And Buber came to this realization of the I and Thou dialectic by seeing refugees, Jewish refugees from the shtetl villages of Eastern Poland coming into the different urbanized, highly cosmopolitan environment of Vienna. And in 1914, this is what Buber helped to reconceptualize through I and Thou. So, war refugees in Eastern Europe. So I want to tell a complicated story and a disturbing global story at times. It doesn't include a lot of easy answers, but I want to tell a nuanced ideology of this period of upheaval. And this is indeed war and social change through the 20th century. I use the world wars to assess the continuities and changes here. But if I'm on the subject of what is religious humanitarianism, let's start there. A shorthand definition, a functional definition, would talk about metaphysical and material aid, a form of humanitarianism in which faith and beliefs about the sacred mattered, where metaphysics went along with material aid to human beings. I talk more about this in the book, but just to say here, the analysis of sacred and secular is a lot easier in theory than it is in practice. Look to the work of Michael Barnett and Janet Gross-Stein, among others, who talk about the difficulty, like one of the worst things you can do is go to the modern mission statements of contemporary organizations and try to pluck out language saying, is this sacred or is this secular? Now, mission statements are interesting statements, but they evolve over time, and there are lots of different intentionalities between organization, donors, recipients, and how this has historically evolved can mean lots of different things to lots of different people. So we need to really talk about more gray zones rather than black and white, either religious or secular. And I really wanted in my work to go beyond the moralizing either for or against religion. I wanted to study religion historically and critically, belief and unbelief, a spectrum of possibilities about total war, which in the historiography of humanitarianism, there's I noticed a stark divergence, especially between the kind of Great War origins of modern humanitarianism, one school of thought, and another school of thought on did this emerge as kind of as a result of the Second World War. I really wanted to talk about both world wars as an analytical unit. And instead of simplistic portrayals, I really stress in my work the need for nuance and paradox throughout. I mean, this builds on the work of excellent other scholars. Didier Fasson has a wonderful book about humanitarian reason. And Fasson talks about the paradox of solidarity, recognizing, wanting to help another, but recognizing an imbalance of power relations between helper and a potential recipient. So the paradox of power. And Alex Duvall, among others, talks about how humanitarians can unintentionally cause hurt, both to themselves as well as the populations that they're trying to help, sometimes through raising false hope or being overwhelmed in a situation of overwhelming need. So it's not an easy story. It's quite complicated. But one of the things I want to do is talk about the spectrum of belief and unbelief, a global history that connects the 19th century to the present through the world wars. If you want to talk about war and social change, this is some of the way I framed it, by looking at Ireland and China in particular. And look at where Ireland was in the 19th century, where so much of humanitarianism is about famine relief in the world wars. The 19th century, Ireland, an example, a global horror story through the famine. And of course, what a change through the 20th century. As of 2019, Ireland was third in the world, third highest quality of life in the world on the UN Development Index for highest quality of life. Quite a remarkable transformation. And we'll talk more about that later. But also consider the case of China. In the beginning of the 20th century, China was an intervention field, global intervention by the European imperialist powers. And now how that power dynamic through China's revolutions and war in the 20th century, how China has changed into a hegemonic power, indeed. Quite a remarkable social transformation through the 20th century. And China leads this, I subtitled the book, which Eve alluded to earlier, is Atheism and Messianism. So in conceptualizing belief and unbelief, I really wanted to tell a global story that talks about the world wars and the contest between the United States and the Soviet Union that emerged. 1917 is an epic moment here. This is, of course, the Russian revolutions, but it's also the intervention of the United States officially entering the war. And so Wilson v. Lenin, and this Wilsonian messianism versus the Leninistic atheism. And I really wanted to build on putting a place in the spectrum for belief and unbelief and the need to come to terms, at least analytically, with making a place for atheism and having a conversation about that. Perhaps we can do more of that in the commentary. But this contest between the United States and the Soviet Union, this is really trying to connect the 19th century to the present. And if you want to talk about, understand the social question of communism and capitalism, you have to go back to the origins in the 19th century. And as Cold War scholars have written, this is really, if you want to understand the Cold War, you really need to make these, talk about continuities as well as changes. And through the 20th century, we come to a remarkable story of religion and secularization. And we really need to rethink teleological narratives. It can help here to begin with the etymology of humanitarianism, which is often a starting point. It's originally an 18th century theological term talking about how Christ's nature was human only. But the 19th century saw amazing cross currents. Yes, movements of huge secularization, especially in Europe, but also the reassertion of religious belief. And scholars like C.A. Bailey and Jürgen Osterhammel have talked about the continuing importance of religion in this sacred secular dynamic process. And if we want to see how this is affecting social change globally, global Christianity is changing. This is the Phil Jenkins book that I highlight here, talking about the next Christendom in the global South. It is estimated that Africa will be the world's largest Christian continent by the year 2030. So there we are, and really, if we want to consider the globality of the sacred secular processes, this is ongoing. In my book, I draw a lot on the work of Bani Ihabwo, talking about the nation-state framework being particularly inappropriate for Africa, where national identities are least settled. And there's a much richer interaction of traditional ideals and ultra-modern developments. The concept of Ubuntu, which you may know as I am, you are. This was important in South Africa, Desmond Tutu and others. Ubuntu, I am, you are. An important human rights concept, and this is indeed not so far, I would argue, from Martin Buber, the I and thou dialect. I mean, there are some key relations there. So I've done a lot of talking. Here's the part of my talk where I ask and talking about for some audience participation. When we talk about the relevance of the sacred secular flux and that neither religious belief nor secularity is the end of history. And forgive me, I see some in the audience here. You're prohibited temporarily from answering. But I want to ask about war and social change here too. So can anyone give me the second most common language of the United States in the early 20th century? Does anyone know what the second most, yeah, correct, German. And of course, then the world wars happened, and it wasn't so advantageous for German to be taught in schools, and it changed. And of course, now, second most common language in America is Spanish. And the importance of the religious question for Latino politics, you really do have to consider these demographic shifts. So very good. Well done on, that was question one. So question two is, beyond English or Irish, what's the next most common language spoken today in Ireland? Thoughts? Polish, you're good historians close to your sources. Now this is correct according to the figures from the 2022 census. But the 2022 census happened before Vladimir Putin's invasion. And so now, because of the Ukrainian refugees, the next most common language is in fact Ukrainian. This is war and social change from the 20th century to the 21st. So really, we have to understand our own societies as well as global history as societies interconnected and in flux. Now, one aspect that I talk about, this is in my book and a source of continuing research interest, is an organization that is called, you now know it as Catholic Relief Services. It started off as the War Relief Services of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. And what I'm intrigued about this organization is the historical development of emergency relief, what started as an emergency quick measure and became development. And a small shoestring organization became a multi-billion-dollar global transnational organization, a sustained global player. So it founded in 1943 and of course continuing today. Now, as part of this story, there are actually really interesting transnational dimensions between especially the United States, Ireland, and Rome, and the role of Irish American clerics in particular. At this point, it is important to remember American Catholicism in the United States, well into the 20th century, was largely led by Irish Catholics. So the transatlantic dimensions of this are really quite striking, and we have people with a historical experience of famine and the famine refugees. Now, Irish Catholics were historical agents of American leadership and integration. And this is a process of famine, empire, immigration, acculturation. But it has important implications for rebuilding World War II Europe. Jerome Andeville has written an excellent book called Ireland's Helping Hand to Europe. And this is looking at post-1945, how Ireland was now helping to feed starving Europe in the aftermath of the Second World War. And this rebuilding and re-civilizing process, Irish American Catholics drew on their immigrant, urban, multi-ethnic melting pot experiences of East Coast cities in particular in the United States and their movements for social reform. So this is the theory and practice of famine relief in an Irish American context, absolutely vital to understanding the social reform of post-1945 Europe. And I could talk about some of the key personages there, but maybe we can talk more about that in the discussion. But moving on, how I see this as potentially a hopeful story in the story of war and devastation and destruction. One possibility. Now, human sympathy and empathy can be directed globally now with practical results of relief so quickly, comparatively quickly, and this was practically unknown in the world before 1914, which I consider a sign of progress and hopefulness. Of course, much remains to be done, but this plethora of NGOs and international organizations, this can mobilize aid, and really in quite striking ways, and this was already being recognized in the 20th century. Some of the religious dimensions, just to put some empirical citations with it, right? Religious organizations or affiliated organizations won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1946. This was John Mott and the YMCA. And in 1947 as well, Rufus Jones and the Quakers. So this is global movements and I think an important development here. But in writing this book, I mean, it was really interesting for me. I had to be more self-reflexive, consciously self-reflexive in this book, and I did it as a methodological approach. Perhaps we could talk more about that in the comments. But I wanted to talk about the limits of the historian and the individual historian and the methodological constraints in telling a global story. So I had to self-identify and put myself into this book a little bit more than I would normally. It was an interesting experiment. But one of the reasons I was interested, I identified as yes, among other things, I studied the history of the Catholic Church. And I'm not here to evangelize for or against the Church. I'm trying to study it historically as a global and transnational traditional institution and study Catholic history as global history. John McGreevy, the scholar at Notre Dame, has an excellent book about global Catholicism. So studying this question of how does tradition adapt? That's what I'm one of the things I'm really interested in. So as part of this, I really did want to include as much as I could non-Catholic perspectives and get a conversation started about, well, different religious groups and non-believers actually talking about the historical importance of these topics. So we could, for the Protestants, I mean, we mentioned the YMCA already, but David King, among other, David King has written an excellent book on the rise of world vision, and this is a multi-billion-dollar Protestant evangelical organization, a kind of Catholic, well, similar in some ways to the Catholic Relief Services story. But the evangelicalism, the Protestant evangelicalism taking place now in areas like Latin America or Ukraine even, it is quite an important global development. So that's the Protestants. I picture here of Herbert Lehman, who is the Director General of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. He became director in the Second World War, but he formed his leadership perspectives based on his experiences with the Joint Distribution Committee in the First World War. And Jacqueline Granick has an excellent book on Jewish humanitarianism in the First World War that you should read. But this is part of what I wanted to study, the links between the world wars as well. Right. And indeed, I talk about the modern Middle East in my book, but just to say quickly here, I don't have enough time to really talk about it in depth now, but Islamic charities as well, and Islamic relief, even breaking apart the Abrahamic faiths, both Christianity and Islam are evangelizing faiths, and that's a different order. Not every religion is evangelizing. So these are sometimes in contestation, but it really encourages us, I hope, to rethink the sacred and secular constructs and really to talk about beliefs and practices outside of the traditions that one was raised in or even trained in. But one thing for the future that I'm also interested in is the implications for Pope Pius XII, who was Pope from 1939 to 1958 during the Second World War and the Holocaust. I'm a consulting professor at a research group that's exploring the newly opened Vatican archives. They opened for the first time for historians in March of 2020. Now it's interesting, the term concepts like impartiality and neutrality, trying to unpack this with a theoretical import of stuff like this means, not only for the Vatican, but for organizations like Switzerland or Ireland, for example. So what do concepts like impartiality and neutrality actually mean? The Red Cross, interestingly enough, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1917 and 1944, but in a 2005 commemoration of the Holocaust, the Red Cross termed this, quote, the greatest failure in the history of the ICRC, end of quote. So these terms, impartiality and neutrality, absolutely key in evaluating the nature of genocide and humanitarian interventions. And I could cite you a letter from Pope Pius that I pulled on the 31st of January, 1943, but we could talk about that in the commentary, perhaps. But yes, so this is an interesting question. Now, history will continue to judge the Pope's responsibility for acting towards all peoples without exception, but now with a lot of new primary source evidence, so we can. It's an exciting time for historians, but I'm less interested in the Pius XII as an anti-historical polemic. What I mean by this is to say, like, people, especially who don't know the historiography, are often looking for the Nixonian questions of what did he know and when did he know it? Well, these have been, we've known about this often for many years, even before the archives were open. The polemics quickly degenerate, I argue, into hypothetical, counterfactual even arguments about moral and ethical questions that are beyond the historian. So what could he or should he have done? Now, we can have these debates, but to realize it's a debate about the limits of history here, too. Now, it's not to say I'm not interested in this. I think there are excellent historical questions that are being asked now about the era of Pope Pius XII, which, after all, until 1958, included such events as the foundation of the State of Israel and communist takeover in China. So there's an incredible global history here now with a new treasure trove of sources, and I think it's a really exciting field. So more for the future. So I'll come to the end here by emphasizing that war and peace are interrelated concepts, and the process of relief and reconstruction begin before war is even over. The question of how wars end informs the question of how human societies fight and help each other. And the destructive and reconstructive legacies of war do not have a convenient historical narrative fiction of a single date in history, even when most of the fighting seems to have stopped. Questions of agency involving action and inaction are key. Who does what to whom? Who is responsible for fellow human beings? The decision not to help is also a form of action, both individually and collectively, and history judges both action and inaction. So these raise disturbing questions, I think, for an interconnected global media world. Humanitarian relief and reconstruction on the spectrum of belief and unbelief in a rapidly changing world of the 20th century is an important historical concept. The legacy of war is not simply this destruction, but also aid. Now consider the continuing efforts to rebuild and reconstruct societies in Afghanistan, Iraq, or think of Ukraine. How does this war end, and how will society be rebuilt? Modern historians of humanitarianism study short-term to long-term processes from emergency aid to development, and this contributes to our understanding relations between concepts of humanitarianism and human rights. Yet one basic handicap in all of this is that for history to really have that perspective, historical understanding takes time for events to assume their relative importance and perspective. And unfortunately, in our contemporary world of practically instantaneous communication, it sometimes seems that the quickening pace of life demands immediate action. However, instead of giving into despair, historians can also point to ways in which things have gotten better. And again, consider the case of Ireland's 20th century development. Is that not social progress? Without denying the problems that exist in contemporary Ireland, I'll just mention housing crisis and cost of living, I'm not blind to these, who among us would get in the time machine and prefer to live in the Ireland of 1914 rather than, say, the Ireland of 2024? Now, in one century, amazing hopeful progress has been made here as a society, and from a global perspective, the world now looks to Ireland as a beacon of hope and progress. Indeed, historians of the age of extremes in the 20th century are well positioned to offer extreme examples of both misery and hope. But the ultimate dilemma of humanitarianism is to get involved or not. And how much can we give of ourselves with our financial resources and our time and our involvement? It raises troubling issues for a 24/7 media age in a globally interconnected world. From positions of comfort and safety, many of us express our opinions, donate a little bit of money, and return to our busy lives. Is that ever enough? And if we pat ourselves on the back for being good people about our response to one conflict, say our help for Ukraine, does that lead us into exhaustion and despair when we consider the ongoing conflicts in other places around the world? And sometimes when we delay, we take time to understand the context. People die from our inaction. So how can we get involved trying to make things better without abandoning ourselves to despair for the numerous conflicts around the globe? I raise these questions, but I do not answer them. So when killing or helping each other, human beings acting in the public sphere are engaged in a contest of values about what kind of society they want. This is the case in times of war and peace. Thus, on a spectrum of belief and unbelief, the history of religious humanitarianism during the era of total war can inform how human societies on a fragile planet should work together towards peace, freedom, and prosperity for all. So I began with Agatha Christie, and I'll close with what could be called a hymn of humanitarianism, and that's the poetry of John Donne, revived for the 20th century by Ernest Hemingway. Quote, "Each man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. Therefore, send not to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee." Thank you very much for your time and attention.